Okay, so welcome to Unit 2, Part B, and we are going to be looking at the three economic questions. And so if you remember us dealing with the issue of scarcity, the idea that we have limited resources to meet our unlimited wants and needs, and therefore we have to make choices, we are going to kind of look at that from society's perspective. How do societies get their needs and wants met? Using these limited resources. And the basic answer is they're going to ask three basic questions. Every society will ask these. And then the way they answer them is going to be carried out through a system, an economic system. And so we're going to learn about that today and just what that means. So let's start off with those three basic questions. Okay, and all these questions are basic questions about the production and the consumption of goods and services, those limited resources. So societies ask what goods and services should be produced, how should the goods and services be produced, and finally, who consumes the goods and services that are produced. They'll have to take a hard look at what resources they have available in terms of their land, what abilities their workers have, so they look at their labor, and then they look at their capital, what kind of human-made machinery and equipment and tools do we have? What kind of human capital do we have? What kind of knowledge and skills do people already bring with them that they've been trained either through education or through experience of life? And so as they ask, what they should produce, how they should produce it, and who will consume it, they're going to have to make some decisions. Okay, so the way society answers these questions defines its economic system. This is just the structure or the methods and principles of a society in how they produce and distribute goods and services. So you might see what we would call a traditional economy, where you have an acre of land, so there's your land. It would take 56 worker hours, not necessarily workers, but just that many hours. And they have these hand tools, okay, and they can produce 15 bushels of wheat. Another system, let's say a free market system, might be able to do the same thing, but because they allowed innovation, someone came up with a tractor, and so instead of hand tools, they've replaced it with a tractor. Now they only need right under 3 hours a tractor, and they're able to produce nearly 3 times as much of the crop. And so, you'll see across society that, different structures will yield different results. And this has to, of course, work in conjunction with government and a number of other things. But we're going to look at 4 main systems. Now, before they even get to a system, every society has to kind of look at these different goals. How are they going to deal with the issue of efficiency? How are they going to deal with the issue of freedom? Who do you want making the decisions? Security. Certainly many governments, it says, provides a safety net to reassure its citizens. Do we just leave people on their own completely? Does the government do certain things, but to do that, how much do they tax you? How do we deal with this issue of equity and fairness? Every society is going to look at that a little differently. You might look at a command economy where they say everyone's equal if everyone pays the exact same thing, or gets the same thing, or the resources are allocated exactly equal, like cutting up a pie into equal pieces. Others might say fairness is, if you work, you eat. And so we're going to look at some of these different ones. So the first one is what we're going to call a traditional economy. This relies on habit, custom, and rituals to answer the 3 economic questions. So if you ask the questions, what goods and services should be produced, they'll kind of only answer that with what they've always produced. What's our habit? What's our custom? How are we going to produce it the way we've always produced it traditionally? Who's this going to be for? Who's going to consume these goods and services that we produce? It's usually going to be their community only. And so you're going to see this in smaller communities, and it tends to work very well in small communities. There's still some communities out there that traditionally practice this in large part. Here in the United States, maybe it's the Amish, for instance. You can see a lot of different tribal groups, both in South America or Africa, and even in Asia, that still do a lot of the traditional ways. Okay, so that'd be a traditional economy. The next one we're going to talk about is free market. You could also call it free enterprise or capitalism. When we say the word market, we're just saying any arrangement that allows buyers and sellers to exchange things. So individuals can specialize in certain things. You know, a farmer can focus only on picking apples and then try to trade those with someone else that does some kind of other production of a good or a service. Okay, and this leads to efficiency. So people can get really good at what they do and then trade with people that do other things. And partly it's so we don't waste our factors of production, and that would be one of the strengths. Now, those who specialize will then try to sell their goods and services that they focus on and buy the ones that they don't. And so in a free market economy, those three economic questions of what are we going to produce, how are we going to produce them, and who's going to consume the goods and services we produce are answered basically by individuals. And by individuals, we mean both those who purchase goods and we also mean those who are producing them. So businesses and people, but not the government. Okay, if you look at this circular flow model, this is of a free market economy because the government's not involved. Free market kind of follows Adam Smith's laissez-faire model. Households would be just what it sounds like, people who live in a household. These would be your consumers. And what they do is they own the land, the labor, and the capital, the factors of production. And so where you see physical flow in the factor market, the factor of production market, a market, again, is a place of it where you exchange things. So here you're exchanging land, labor, and capital. So the households send land, labor, capital to the businesses or the firms. And in exchange, the businesses pay them. So you see monetary flow. Now, what happens is the entrepreneur is going to take that land, labor, capital that they purchased in the factor market, and then they're going to turn around and they're going to create goods and services and then sell. The physical flow here would be the actual goods and services or the products that they make, and they sell those back to the households who give them money. Okay, so that's a free market circular flow model. Now, since I said that Adam Smith talked about laissez-faire in this regard and the government not really being involved in making those decisions, answering those three questions, he said that competition would be what regulates the market in the absence of a government. In other words, if there's enough people selling goods that you can go to, so he'd probably be against monopolies, for instance, the competition will keep things fair. They'll hold down prices because a business that, for instance, charged too much for a good or was not treating the customer right, the customer would have options because of that competition, and therefore it would hold everything in line and keep things moving. And he said our own self-interest would basically motivate us to go out and buy because we need our needs and wants met, right? Because of scarcity. So our self-interest to go purchase things to meet our needs and wants would drive us as consumers. And for producers, the motivation to sell their goods to make money so that they could also go out and buy their goods and services to meet their needs and wants would be the driving force. So no central planning would be required according to this. And so he would say the market self-regulates. In other words, this invisible hand of self-interest and competition are basically pursuing, everyone pursuing their own interest. They have to compete with others, but they also have to serve others too. In other words, as a business person, if I was going to answer the three questions, what am I going to produce? I have to be thinking about the needs of others. Doesn't mean I have to like them or anything else, as Walter Williams has talked about, an economist. But you do have to serve them, he says, and this is true. So you see the advantages of this. You have efficiency. If someone's not buying a certain product, we don't want to waste our resources making it. We can easily change and go to something else. Freedom of choice, both for the buyers and the sellers. There's growth and innovation. We can always try to find a better way to do something as we answer the second question of how do we produce this. And there's a variety of goods and services, which leads to a higher standard of living. Now, the disadvantages here are obvious. There is not really any equity or fairness. So, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. there's no one really jumping in and regulating anything. And so you have a lack of economic security as well. And so one thing we have to note, though, as we talk about these, there is no pure free market economy. As you know, you can find the freest economies right now would be like Singapore and Hong Kong. But really, the government is involved at some level. So we can't really say it's purely free market. But what we'll see later is a spectrum that countries tend to lean more free market, or they tend to lean towards this next one, which we call centrally planned or command economies. Okay, so societies that rely on central planning to answer the three economic questions, basically government answers the three questions. What are we going to produce? You know, in government, whatever that looks like, it could take many forms. Anything from socialism, where you have certain socialistic systems are in democracies, so we don't want to confuse these with types of government. You can have a democracy like Canada, for instance, that has socialistic medicine. The government makes all the decisions of what they're going to produce, what services they're going to offer, who gets them, how do they get them, how are the market resources distributed. Or you could have it on the other end of the spectrum where you have a communist dictator, or maybe even like with the old Soviet Union, the Politburo. China today, while they have a president, they have more a ruling council. But basically the government, whatever form that looks like, making the decisions of how to answer the three questions and then distributing that would be an example of central planning. Now, notice the difference between socialism and communism here on the Venn diagram. This will pop up on the test, and it's something that you need to know. So study that. Now, some of the advantages and disadvantages of this, and they all have the same goals. We're trying to use our basic resources and not waste anything to get most of our needs and wants met. But remember, they both, free market and command economy, look at those goals of efficiency and freedom and security and those things a little differently. Now, the advantages of a command system is that they can guarantee jobs and income. The government's providing everything, and so everyone basically works, you know, where the government says and for how much. And so the government can instantly provide, let's say, land, labor, capital to jumpstart an industry and say, hey, tomorrow we're going to produce cars, and we've never done that before, but here's the steel, here's the, you know, all the various land, labor, and capital. Here's who's working there. Here's what you're going to do. Here's the machinery. And then the next day you could actually have a car company. We're here in the United States, when we pursue things from more of a free market stance, we would have to have an entrepreneur, you know, start a business, go try to find supporters, backing, develop a prototype, convince people to invest. You know, there's this long process, and it may not get off the ground, or it may take years. So there is an advantage to the government just basically saying, here, everyone shares everything equally. You know, those are the advantages of this type of system. Now, the disadvantages are you don't have a lot of efficiency. If the government's the only one making the decisions, you're not having that competition that's going to create better ways of doing things or even better products. There's a lack of economic equity. Even though everyone's sharing everything equally, you know, you can see this picture here, the old Soviet Union especially, we found that, you know, it wasn't really getting done what they had hoped. And so there's a lack of growth and innovation, and people's needs and wants are severely lacking. Okay, in truth, most economies are mixed, and then they tend to lean either towards free market or towards command economy. And by mixed, we mean the government is involved at some level, and individual decision making to answer the three questions is also involved at some level. Okay, so why do governments tend to get involved in the economy to some degree? Some needs of modern society would be difficult to meet in the marketplace. Think of things like national defense or large highway systems, for instance. Some supply needs to achieve the goal of equity. So public school, for instance, here in the United States, everyone has the option to go to that, and that's provided through tax dollars or government. In the free market leaning societies, governments might protect private property rights. And so you have to have a government to enforce those rights. to make sure that if someone cheats or steals, you have to have a court system, for instance, a police force, the basic things to ensure the very rights of the laws you make. And 4 here, you can make sure that exchanges in the marketplace are fair. If businesses cheat, consumers need to have an option to recover their losses. Okay. And then governments also accommodate people's current views of redistribution of wealth. In the United States, for instance, we have a progressive system, so we tax the rich more. And we'll talk more about that later. But our idea of fairness is wealthy pay more, poorer people get services that maybe they did not contribute tax dollars to. But we do that for different reasons based on our values, and our values can change, and that's why we have elections. Where, somewhere like the old Soviet Union or current China or others, these decisions, like we said, are being made by the government. Now, when you put the government involved, and we're going to have a video that you'll watch about the circular flow, but just remember what I said earlier. Here we add the government, and notice that the households can also sell them land, labor, capital here where it says government-owned factors, and the government will pay those households in the form of an expenditure. And where they got their money in the factor market was businesses or firms pay taxes to the government when they pay households for land, labor, capital. So if you are labor and you work somewhere, you get a paycheck, but there's taxes taken out of that. But when we buy things as households, as consumers in the product market and give money to businesses, we also pay taxes. Government gets those taxes, and they also purchase goods and services from the firms. Okay. So here's the spectrum I mentioned. This is just a small sampling, but you can see Singapore is probably the most free in terms of their marketplace. The U.S. and Canada, lean free market. With Canada, they would probably be a little bit over here compared to the United States, just simply for some of the socialism they have in terms of their medical and other things. Mexico, kind of right here. Then going more towards centrally planned, you have Iran, and then North Korea. Okay. All right, so we will continue on our next slideshow.